On September 15, 1944, Major General William Rupertus told his Marines they'd secure the small Pacific island of Peleliu in 4 days, maybe 5 at the outside. In a pre-invasion speech to his own men, he had described the operation as a quick, rough fight that would be over almost before it began. It ended up taking 73. By the time it was over, the 1st Marine Division had suffered the highest casualty rate of any amphibious assault the United States fought in the entire Pacific War, and military historians are still divided on whether the island needed to be invaded at all. This is the Battle of Peleliu, the battle American commanders themselves, later called entirely unnecessary, fought against an enemy that had just invented an entirely new way to make Americans pay dearly for every single yard of ground. Peleliu is tiny, about 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, part of the Palau Islands, roughly 800 kilometers southeast of Manila, a speck of coral and jungle that few Americans could have located on a map before 1944. In the summer of 1944, American planners wanted it for one reason. Its airfield sat close enough to the Philippines that Japanese aircraft based there, in theory, could threaten General Douglas MacArthur's planned invasion of the islands he had promised to retake. Admiral Chester Nimitz approved the invasion as a supporting operation, part of the broader Operation Forager campaign that had already secured the Marianas earlier that summer. Then, just 2 days before the Marines were due to land, Admiral William "Bull" Halsey's carrier pilots discovered something that should have changed everything. Japanese defenses across the Philippines were far weaker than anyone had assumed, and MacArthur's invasion timetable could be moved up dramatically. Halsey recommended canceling Peleliu outright. Nimitz decided it was too late to call it off, with preparations for the invasion already too far advanced to reverse course cleanly. The invasion went ahead anyway, against a target whose original strategic justification had, in the span of 48 hours, largely disappeared. Waiting on the island were roughly 11,000 Japanese troops of the 14th Infantry Division, a unit previously stationed in China as part of the Kwangtung Army before its transfer to the Palaus under a colonel named Kunio Nakagawa. And Nakagawa had spent months preparing something the U.S. Marine Corps had never encountered at this scale before. Every previous Japanese island defense in the Pacific War had tried, in one way or another, to stop the Americans at the water's edge, meet the landing craft with everything available, and throw the invasion back into the sea. Nakagawa did the opposite. He built almost no fixed defenses on the beaches at all. Instead, he turned the jagged coral high ground at the island's center, a knot of ridges and caves the Marines would soon nickname the Umurbrogel, and then simply Bloody Nose Ridge, into a honeycomb of interconnected tunnels, bunkers, and firing positions, many of them with steel blast doors, positioned with pre-registered artillery and mortars aimed at exactly the ground the Marines would have to cross to reach them. His defenses included 24 75mm artillery pieces and roughly a dozen light tanks, all sited to support a network of positions that had been under construction for months before a single American ship appeared on the horizon. The American armada that eventually arrived off the Palaus was enormous by any standard. 868 ships in total, with 129 of them making up the actual assault element, supported by 3 days of naval gunfire and airstrikes that included U.S. Army Air Force's B-24 bombers dropping more than 600 tons of bombs on the tiny island before the landing even began. The pre-invasion naval bombardment was supposed to run for 4 full days. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf called it off a day early, reportedly telling his staff he had run out of targets. There was simply nothing visible left worth shelling, because Nakagawa's real defenses were buried too deep underground to be touched by naval gunfire at all. American commanders took the quiet as a good sign. It wasn't. It meant the island's actual defenses hadn't been damaged in any meaningful way, and the Marines, due to land in less than 24 hours, had no idea what was actually waiting for them. The Marines landed at 8:30 on the morning of September 15th, and the illusion of an easy fight collapsed within the hour. Japanese gunners, who had pre-sighted every approach to the beach, opened fire on the landing craft as the steel doors of their hidden positions swung open. Positions built into coral promontories on both flanks of the landing beaches caught the incoming waves in a devastating crossfire, firing 47-millimeter guns and 20-millimeter cannons directly down the length of the beach as amphibious tractors tried to cross the reef line 700 yards offshore. 60 American amphibious vehicles were destroyed before most of the Marines had even made it ashore. By the end of the first day alone, the 1st Marine Division had already suffered 1,300 casualties, a number some units in the Pacific War never reached across an entire campaign. Unknown to the Americans at the time, Nakagawa's own forces were suffering as well. A Japanese counterattack launched that same day cost him one of his 5 infantry battalions and most of his remaining armor, along with several hundred dead across the front. Losses that went almost entirely unnoticed by American commanders, who had no way of knowing how much of Nakagawa's conventional fighting strength had already been spent trying to blunt the landing. The southern part of the island, including the airfield that had justified the entire operation, fell relatively quickly. By around September 23rd, the beachhead was secure and the airstrip was in American hands, allowing Marine aircraft to begin operating from it within days. If the battle had ended there, Peleliu would be remembered as a hard but conventional Pacific landing, costly but broadly in line with what commanders had expected going in. Instead, the fighting simply moved inland, into terrain that made every earlier Pacific battle look almost survivable by comparison. The Umur was, in the words of Marines who survived it, less a hill than a maze of blasted coral ridges, sinkholes, and caves, some large enough to hide a piece of artillery, others barely wide enough for 2 men, all of them camouflaged, and virtually all of them requiring Marines to clear by hand at close range, cave by cave, because naval guns and airstrikes simply couldn't reach what was buried inside the rock. Clearing a single position often meant a small team working forward under covering fire, throwing satchel charges or grenades into an opening, and waiting to see whether the position stayed silent, knowing that a cave believed cleared the day before could reopen fire from a connected tunnel entrance discovered nowhere on any map. One Marine after-action report described the caves as ranging from simple 2-man holes to elaborate tunnel networks large enough to hold artillery pieces and stockpiled ammunition, many fitted with steel doors and camouflaged so effectively that positions often went undetected until they opened fire on Marines who had already walked past them. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's 1st Marine Regiment took the worst of it. Over roughly 200 hours of fighting on the ridge that would forever carry his division's blood in its name, Puller's regiment suffered more than 1,600 casualties. One battalion was reduced to a 71% casualty rate. By the time it was finally pulled off the line, only 74 men remained standing from what had been 9 full rifle companies. Clearing the Umur required tools and tactics American forces hadn't relied on this heavily before. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads worked cave by cave, often just yards from Japanese positions that couldn't be seen until they opened fire. Tanks fitted with makeshift armor plating pushed forward wherever the terrain allowed, providing point-blank fire support for infantry too exposed to advance without it. None of it was fast. Every ridge cleared seemed to reveal another one behind it, connected by tunnels that let Japanese defenders reappear in positions Marines had already fought through and left behind. Conditions for the men still fighting were almost as brutal as the enemy. Temperatures on the exposed coral routinely climbed past 100 degrees, with no shade and no natural cover beyond what the fighting itself created. Fresh water had to be shipped ashore in empty oil drums that hadn't been properly cleaned, contaminating much of the supply and making men sick from the water meant to keep them alive. American forces used napalm on Peleliu, only the second time it had ever been deployed in the Pacific War, specifically because it was one of the only tools capable of doing real damage to positions dug too deep into coral for anything else to touch. Rupertus himself became something close to a final casualty of his own battle. Having predicted a 4-day fight that instead cost his division roughly 6,800 men, killed or wounded, he returned to the United States that November to take up a training command at Quantico, his reputation permanently marked by the miscalculation that had sent so many of his Marines into a fight far worse than anyone had prepared them for. By late September, the U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division, fresh off a quicker victory on the nearby island of Okinawa, was brought in to relieve the exhausted 1st Marine Division and continue grinding through what remained of Nakagawa's defenses. The Army troops inherited a fight that had already changed the entire division's fighting style. Cave by cave, position by position, with progress measured in yards rather than miles, and casualties mounting on a battlefield that from a distance could look almost deceptively quiet. It took them another month. The fighting didn't stop until November 24th, when Colonel Nakagawa, down to a final scattering of defenders, sent his last message to his superiors. "Our sword is broken and we have run out of spears." He split what remained of his command into small groups, with orders to keep attacking, burned his regimental colors, and, along with his second-in-command, took his own life rather than surrender. Peleliu was declared secure on November 27, 1944, 73 days after Rupertus had promised his men it would be over in 4. The final numbers make Peleliu one of the costliest island battles, relative to its size, of the entire Pacific War. American forces suffered somewhere near 10,000 total casualties, including roughly 1,700 killed, a toll split between the 1st Marine Division's roughly 6,800 casualties and additional losses suffered by the Army's 81st Infantry Division during its month of continued fighting. Of the 11,000 Japanese troops who defended the island, fewer than 200 survived to be taken prisoner. The rest fought essentially to annihilation, exactly as Nakagawa's superiors had planned from the start, never intending or arranging for any evacuation of their own men at all. Proportional to the forces involved, it produced the highest American casualty rate of any amphibious landing the United States conducted anywhere in the Pacific War. And in one final, strange coda to the fighting, a small holdout group of Japanese soldiers, a lieutenant, 26 infantrymen, and 8 Guard Force troops, kept hiding in Peleliu's caves for years after the war had ended, refusing to believe Japan had surrendered, surviving on jungle foraging and what supplies remained hidden in the tunnel network, until a Japanese admiral was finally sent to the island in April 1947 to personally convince them the war was over. The strategic payoff for all of this, in the years since, has been the subject of genuine and ongoing debate among historians. MacArthur's return to the Philippines went ahead on October 20, 1944, while the fighting on Peleliu was still going, more than a month away from being finished, using a route that Halsey's discovery had already made Peleliu's airfield largely unnecessary for. Some retired officers who studied the campaign afterward went further, arguing that the entire operation should never have been launched once Halsey's carrier pilots reported how weak Japanese defenses in the Philippines actually were, calling the decision to proceed anyway a failure of exactly the kind of flexible strategic judgment that had served American commanders well throughout most of the island-hopping campaign. What the battle did produce was a hard lesson about what Japan's new defense-in-depth tactics No beach defense, deep cave networks, a fight-to-annihilation strategy designed purely to maximize American casualties rather than actually hold ground, would look like for the rest of the war. Those same tactics, refined further, would appear again at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, at even greater scale and cost, and some historians argue the brutal lessons learned in the caves of Peleliu directly shaped how American planners thought about the potential cost of an eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands itself, a calculation that, in the final year of the war, weighed on decisions far larger than any single Pacific Island battle. None of that made the 73 days on Peleliu any less real for the men who fought them. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who served there with the 5th Marines and later wrote one of the most unflinching combat memoirs of the entire war, described the losses suffered by Puller's 1st Marines in blunt terms. His own unit had lost plenty of friends, he wrote, but the men of the 1st Marines had lost so many it was almost impossible to comprehend. Sledge would go on to fight at Okinawa as well, and his account of both campaigns became, decades later, one of the primary sources historians and documentary filmmakers alike have drawn on to understand what these battles actually felt like from the perspective of the men fighting them, cave by cave and ridge by ridge, with no way of knowing how much further the line still had to move. Peleliu remains, even among Pacific War historians, one of the least publicly remembered major battles of 1944, overshadowed by Iwo Jima, overshadowed by Okinawa, fought and largely forgotten within months of its own ending. The men who survived it never had that luxury. If you want to hear how the lessons of Peleliu's caves shaped the invasion planning for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, that's a story for another video. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.